Hello, Buckeye Nation. Welcome back to the Silver Bullets podcast. I am Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnich.
And Chip, the Buckeyes are now 7-0, a perfect record. So obviously everything in Columbus is perfect and nothing can be improved upon in the play of Ohio State.
That's one way of looking at it, I guess. I realize it's gonna sound like we're both a bunch of malcontents, but after the carnage of so many teams that suffered losses yesterday, but the reality is there's a lot of troubling things that Ohio State needs to address before they go to West Lafayette, and I am not entirely confident that 1 week is going to be sufficient to address everything that ails the Buckeyes.
Well, since 3 weeks haven't been enough, I don't know what one more week is going to do. It's been we're talking about the same things, or we will be talking about the same things as we've been talking about all year. Safety play, linebacker play, not as many penalties this week, so there's that. But then the running game, obviously. But we're going to throw in some really horrific play in the pass protection from the offensive tackles this week. So, it seems like instead of getting better and better week by week, Ohio State is getting exposed in more and more areas every week, and that's pretty concerning.
Absolutely. I mean, truth be told, I was actually in the stands yesterday in Ohio Stadium for the first time this season. I hadn't shared that with Michael before recording this podcast, so I can kind of give you, I know we're a kind of a family-oriented bunch at the Ozone Radio Network, so I can't share with you all of the colorful adjectives that people were using that I overheard while in the stands, but I can promise you there's a lot of concern about, as you said, like things that for the last several weeks, people were just expressing dismay and disbelief at what they were seeing on the field.
Yeah, first of all, I want to give credit to PJ Fleck because I think that he got his team more ready to play than I expected Minnesota to be. I think that they played maybe harder than any team that has played against Ohio State this year, including Penn State. I think that Minnesota showed more fight against Ohio State than anyone we've seen. And that, like I said, that includes Penn State, includes TCU. Minnesota came ready to play. They were fired up. They were not bothered when Ohio State did some things well and scored early. They just took everything in their stride, and they played hard. And one of the real places that showed up was in short yardage situations, both in Minnesota's offense at the goal line and in short yardage Ohio State plays. Now we've documented the short yardage issues, but although really if you go back and you look at the third and short, fourth and short situations this year, Ohio State still has converted the vast majority of those. But in recent weeks, we've seen that not be the case in some key places, and I think people are making this out to be a bigger issue than it has been this season. But of course, you want to get better in those areas, and Ohio State isn't getting better in those areas. So there's reason for concern. I'm not trying to downplay anyone's concern about it. I'm just saying that by and large, it's been pretty good overall for the season if you look at it overall. But if you look at it in recent weeks, it hasn't been quite as good as we would like it to be. But so again, kudos to PJ Fleck for getting his team ready to play. I thought that Minnesota played hard. They had some really good answers for some of the things that Ohio State likes to do. And I thought Ohio State did not play with a lot of enthusiasm. I know it's a noon kickoff, but that's 11 a.m. body clock time for Minnesota. And it was like you could tell from the crowd too. I mean, I wasn't there, but you could tell on TV that the crowd was kind of only getting up and getting loud in certain situations. It's one of those games, and I think we've seen these at Ohio Stadium many times, where the crowd kind of expects a big win. They don't really – you almost need Ohio State to make a play to get them excited and to get them in the game, and that really was a problem on Saturday in terms of getting them on their feet.
Yeah, I mean, being in the stadium – You just mentioned the word enthusiasm, and I don't know if it was on the the broadcast or not. I believe it was at the end of the third quarter going into the fourth quarter that all of a sudden you saw the Minnesota, the team come over to the sideline, and PJ Fleck sprinted down the sideline to greet his team at the, since they were going to be changing sides for the quarter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did show that.
Okay, so I'm just saying, you talk about enthusiasm gap. I mean, that guy certainly was not, even though Minnesota was losing at the time, they were playing. Somebody around me was saying that Minnesota was playing to win, and Ohio State was basically playing to survive. Like they did not have the same kind of approach or killer instinct. At least that's what it seemed like from in the stadium.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you that I think sometimes the fans, a noon start. It was cold, and I say that as a lifelong Ohioan. I mean, it wasn't freezing, but it was cold. I mean, it was gray and overcast for the vast majority of the game. It was probably, I would guess, like maybe 50 degrees at kickoff. It seemed colder than that. Obviously didn't seem to bother Minnesota. And I'm not using that as an excuse, but you mentioned the lack of enthusiasm from the crowd. I think the noon start, as well as just kind of the, 1 week after playing Indiana when it was 85, to kind of all of a sudden, have kind of, oh, wow, like a fall, like weather game, I think fans are just kind of, we're just kind of looking at this as, oh, Ohio State's going to blow these guys out. And when that didn't happen, it just kind of added to a lackluster performance that was already on the field.
Yeah, I think Minnesota definitely pulled out all the stops in terms of trying to get jacked up for the game. They mentioned on the broadcast that PJ Fleck had them the night before the game watching the Miracle on Ice movie so that they could, see what it was like to have to come up with what kind of effort was necessary for a huge upset like that, and to get the emotional juices flowing like the day before the game. Ohio State, I would say that they played like they wanted to survive so much as I think they played like they just expected to show up and win. They didn't expect a big fight from Minnesota. I think that there's still some residual letdown a little bit from the Penn State game. That was like, okay, now we've got Indiana, Minnesota. We don't have to really do much until Michigan State. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think that in college football, as we've seen this weekend, you got to come ready to play every week, or anyone can get you on the right day. And I didn't think LSU was a bad team, but I still didn't expect them to beat Georgia, and I didn't expect them to beat Georgia seemingly as simply as they did. And you saw UCF play Memphis and need to rally to win by 1 point. And of course, there were other upsets as well. Other teams in the top 10 went down. Washington lost, and help me out. There's a few others that went down that I'm not thinking of right now. And also, Notre Dame almost got beat by Pitt at home. So there were, on the one hand, there's like a Saturday or two every year where it seems like every top team is challenged. Some of them don't pass those challenges. Ohio State did. So, maybe they could take a deep breath, count their blessings, and take this as the warning sign it is and try to get better. I don't expect Ohio State's offensive tackles to get abused like they did against Minnesota. And again, we talked about Minnesota being a 21st ranked total defense, and we kind of scoffed at that, but they did some things that really Ohio State had a lot of trouble answering, especially in the second half of the game.
Yeah, the only contribution I would make in terms of a team that, and I'm not saying that this necessarily was an upset. It probably should be, just because Penn State was the home team, but Michigan State went on the road and beat Penn State for the second year in a row. And the fact that Ohio State fans were kind of looking at, okay, well, Penn State, they're definitely the second best team in the conference. I don't think you can say that with any kind of specific evidence to back that up after the fact that Ohio State beat them, how Michigan State beat them. Both of those losses were at home. But getting back to Minnesota, the only player on that roster that had to the best of my knowledge, had an offer to play at Ohio State and chose to go to Minnesota was Minnesota defensive end Carter Coughlin, who had a very good game. He certainly warranted all of the praise. He wore number 45 for Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
He was the one that Urban Meyer was citing all last week in preparation for the game. So he had a very good game. He certainly showed why Ohio State had an interest in him. I agree with you, though, that the Ohio State offensive tackle, something has to change schematically, personnel-wise, both. I don't know, but because Coughlin with being the exception, there really isn't anyone on that Minnesota defense that you would think. Yeah, I agree with you. We were kind of scoffing at the ranking of Minnesota's defense, but the talent on Ohio State's offensive line should have been enough that Ohio State should have been able to, if not necessarily give ample pass protection to Dwayne Haskins, better than they did. Because he seemed, he had some sacks. He, was rushed into some throws, and certainly the offensive line has the talent. We've been led to believe that should be able to have Ohio State be able to put up at least 100 yards on the ground, because that is extremely concerning going into the month of November.
Absolutely. The big day for Coughlin, as you mentioned, he had 5 tackles. Seemed like more. 2 sacks, 3 tackles for loss, forced a fumble, and I don't know how they qualify quarterback hurries, but in the defensive statistics, they didn't have any on Minnesota or Ohio State, so maybe they don't even count those. But I will tell you that he forced Dwayne Haskins out of the pocket on multiple occasions and forced Haskins to run on multiple occasions. So he was a force. Isaiah Prince looked like a turnstile or a traffic cone, whatever you want to use as a metaphor. Maybe the worst game for Isaiah Prince since he became a starter, since he first started starting games.
Yeah, he regressed. That was definitely his worst game since a few years ago against Penn State. Also, in the latter portion, the last game of the season against that team up north in 2016, he certainly, it seems as though if he has a breakdown, or regardless of whether he gets beat or just bad technique or whatever it might be, it seems he has a very difficult time of putting a bad play or bad plays behind him and letting it stick with him and turning 1 or 2 bad plays into 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be. And that is concerning because we're going into the stretch run. I keep talking about the idea that, with November, but those games, Ohio State for the last couple games against Minnesota, against Indiana at home, were games that Ohio State fans certainly expected that they would win with much, much greater ease than they had. Now they're going on the road to Purdue. Now, granted, they still have a home game against Nebraska, and they have a couple road games at Michigan State and at Maryland, but they can't afford to have Isaiah Prince if he's struggling against the opposition's pass rush, worrying about a bad play or that he got beat, because that's going to wind up getting Dwayne Haskins hurt. And if you think that we're concerned now, just imagine if Dwayne Haskins gets hurt, because this offense is just completely sluggish. It just seems as though that they're completely one-dimensional. And I mean, I know we're going to talk about it in greater detail, but we've expressed concern about the fact that Ohio State is unable to run the ball when they want to. And yesterday completely manifested that on the football field.
Yeah, I've still got this thing in my head where I'm wondering how much of this is because Haskins has been so good. It's been a play calling crutch of sorts for the coaching staff, that they are not consistent in their approach at attacking via the ground game. And they let a bad play here and there dictate how they call the game. I think if you go to the end of the game when Ohio State was trying to run the clock out, that was their best rushing all day. So it clearly is something they can do when they put their minds to it. But at times, it almost seems like they don't really try all that hard. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, if they have a play on first down that is a yard or maybe even loses a yard or two, they don't have the trust in the run game, and they have so much trust in Dwayne Haskins that they don't run the ball on second and long. This is something that when Carlos Hyde was there, when Ezekiel Elliott was there, even in years past with Weber and Dobbins, they weren't afraid to run on a 2nd and 12 play. They would gladly run on a 2nd and 12 play, and they would pick up 6 or 8 yards and make it a manageable third down. They're not even trying that this year.
But the difference there is when you mentioned Carlos Hyde, they had Braxton Miller at quarterback. And then when they had Zeke, most of the time, as well as last year when they had Weber and Dobbins, they had J.T. Barrett. So it seems that might be the fact that they knew that they had a quarterback who could effectively run that zone read, which is non-existent. Nobody believes that Haskins is going to keep the ball. Haskins doesn't believe he's going to keep the ball. So if the defense, they can just tee off on that the zone read should just be eliminated. It should just be a straight handoff in some way, shape, or form. Just hand it off, okay? And maybe that would improve because you're going to tell Michael Jordan, you're going to tell Demetrius Knox, you're going to tell Malcolm Pridgeon, we're going to run ISOs and counters and whatever it might be, but Dwayne is not going to be carrying the ball. And I bet you the improvement by the offensive line would be substantial.
Yeah, I would think so. I really believe that this team can run the football against the teams that it's played against the last few weeks. And it just, for whatever reason, again, yeah, you got to take the zone read out of it because even people on Twitter were saying during the game on Saturday that Dwayne had he had numbers in the run game a few times and held the ball and chose the pass option in the RPO. Maybe it's just a matter of simplifying the offense. Either it's a straight run or it's a pass play. The RPO thing, when you've got a weapon like Dwayne Haskins, do you really need to be all that tricky? Probably not. When you have Zone 6 playing the way that it has been playing, this season, you probably don't need to get that complicated. And I think sometimes when you're struggling as a team, simplifying things and stripping things down to the basics can help. I mean, look, Woody used to run 6 plays? 6 different plays,
right?
And that was it. I mean, even if you knew exactly which play he was going to run, the execution was such that you couldn't stop it anyway. So I think there's a lot to that. But why don't we get into the game a little bit? It started out with Ohio State scoring first, but again, settling for a field goal early when personally, this was one of the things that got my goat early, and it was in my column, The Grumpy Old Buckeye. You can't ski behind the receiver, and Austin Mack should have had a touchdown catch on the first drive, and if he didn't catch it because the defensive back had the shirt and was pulling hard on it so that it was stretched out, pretty obvious to see, not called, and have to settle for 3 instead of 7 early. And one of those things that you want to do when you have an underdog come in is step on their throat early. And having to settle for a field goal when you have a goal-to-go situation is not stepping on the throat. So, but kudos to Blake Hobbill for coming on for Sean Nurnberger and hitting the field goal and actually having a good day. He was Ohio State's Special Teams Player of the Week, and I can't argue with that, although Drew Chrisman was fine. He was his usual self. Minnesota answered with a touchdown drive, made it 7-3. Again, same problems, big long runs because linebackers are not filling the right holes or there's no edge being set. And a guy just makes a quick little cutback and he's got a 40-yard run. But big runs, big passes, and Minnesota leads. Ohio State comes back quickly. Terry McLaurin with a 41-yard pass. Great catch from Dwayne Haskins makes it 10-7. Minnesota scored to make it 14-10 in the second quarter, early in the second quarter, on another run up the middle at the goal line from Abraham, who had a big day running against Ohio State. Pretty much a career day for him. 23 carries, 157 yards, 2 touchdowns. Most of that in the first half. KJ Hill with a 36-yard pass from Haskins to make it 17-14. And that was the score at halftime. Very surprising score, just a 3-point separation at halftime. And then the Buckeyes went into the locker room to, I guess, some boos at the stadium.
Oh, you're not guessing. You're not guessing. It was, I mean, I will say that falls under the category of very spoiled, entitled. The idea that, what do you mean we're winning, but we're not winning enough?
Yeah, right.
And that's where Ohio State fans, I think, have to kind of take things with a little better dose of perspective. That, as you said a few moments ago, and I couldn't agree more, that in every week in college football, you have to come prepared. Who's to say that Ohio State, that they didn't come into this thinking, okay, this is Minnesota, we're a substantial favorite, we're going to roll these guys, and the next thing you know, Minnesota is pulling out all the stops, like you said. They kind of figured, we're decided underdogs. Mm-hmm. Let's just do what we can, and we're gonna put a scare into these guys, and they certainly did, by the fact that at 17-14, it was not nearly the lead that we anticipated. I think, based on our predictions for last week, as well as I think that the overall, almost anybody throughout college football who follows Ohio State closely.
Yeah, I'm not. I've learned my lesson. I'm not going to guarantee a Tate Martell or Master Teague sighting anymore this year.
Okay, I'll have to agree with. I really did believe that this was going to be the game for all of the backups, and if there was backups that were cited, it was primarily along the defensive line, because, as Urban Meyer has stated over and over, and he's right, that this is the time of year everybody is dealing with bumps and bruises and nagging injuries, and Ohio State fans knew that they were going to be without the services of Nick Bosa, but they also had to deal without Jonathan Cooper being out of the lineup, Malik Harrison out of the lineup. So there were a lot more backups, seeing, for example, some of those true freshmen. Tyler Friday was in there. I believe Haskell Garrett was playing. There were a lot more defensive linemen who have usually played more in a backup role that were thrust into more prominent playing time roles simply because of the accumulated injuries along the defensive line.
Yeah, I wanted to see more of Tommy Togiai, because I really felt like Ohio State's defensive line was getting pushed around a little bit. It's clear to me the last 2 weeks that Draymond Jones is not healthy.
No, he's not.
He doesn't have the explosion that he normally has. I think he had one play that he just completely blew up. But Draymond Jones is a guy who blows up 2 or 3 plays a quarter, not a guy who you flashes once in a game. He does not look quite right. Chase Young was, I don't know if he's nursing something, but he was kind of invisible most of the game as well. You mentioned that 2 of the top 3 defensive ends being out, since Bosa's still out, and Malik Harrison being out. He's been, by and large, the team's best linebacker this year. I don't think that's even arguable. And no. It was just not a good outing for the defense at all, especially in the first half. Now, once again, we see in the second half they come out. They did give up a few plays here and there. They didn't give up any scores, partly because Minnesota missed 2 field goals, and partly because possibly because Minnesota got a little conservative at times. But I think overall, part of the problem with the secondary has been, the last couple weeks, has been that the defensive line's not getting pressure on the quarterback and forcing things. And even so, Annexstad threw 2 interceptions, one to a safety and one to a cornerback, if memory serves. So even without pressure, they got 2 interceptions, and it would be really nice to see that defensive line get healthy because they could use them. Now, Ohio State came out with all the scoring in the second half. Blake Hobble 47-yard field goal. I was really surprised, Chip, that they tried a long field goal. I mean, even if the starting kicker was in there, that's not a distance that Urban Meyer likes to kick from.
It isn't, but I also believe that is and not that Urban Meyer would want to concede this either. I think it was a concession to the fact that the Ohio State offense was struggling and he wanted points, and that faith and belief in Blake Hobble's leg to be able to do it. Nuernberger, I'm not entirely sure why he wasn't in the game. I know that he suffered some kind of I saw him walking, but it didn't look like he had any kind of a limp, and so I believe that Gerd and Tom Orr mentioned on their in their post game that they were that some kind of the reason given was some kind of strain, but wasn't really identified what kind of strain it was. I like the way how Gerd said it, like if he's suffering from the Ebola strain, he shouldn't be down there. But anyway, that getting back to the whole Blake Hobble thing, yes, he definitely was one of the shining points on the Ohio State offense, and the fact that he contributed with the field goals. Last year, one of the things that frustrated me to no end was when Ohio State, with kickoffs, being, kicking the ball out of bounds and giving the opponent the ball on the 35, that Urban Meyer would consistently claim, it's, we don't have the kickers that can just boom it out of the end zone. And anyone who saw Blake Hobble, not just yesterday, but when he was a recruit, knew that was not the case. Blake Hobble could definitely boom the ball, through the end zone. So that 47-yard field goal, that was a positive in the sense that it's nice to know in the event that Ohio State needs a long field goal that they'll be able to have somebody who can do it. I certainly believe that Hobble has the stronger leg. It's not meant disrespectfully to Sean Nuernberger, but I believe he has the stronger leg and can kick those longer field goals if called upon to do so.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing that leg in full force. We don't have I think everybody rolled their eyes pretty hard at Meyer saying that we don't have the kickers that can reach the back of the end zone.
Oh, I know.
Because you're seeing it this year. Blake Hobble didn't just suddenly learn how to do this. He's booming them out the back of the end zone almost every time, unless they try to kick it high and pin the team deep. They still do that occasionally, although you don't get to do it as much with the fair catch rule these days. But still, every now and then they sucker the other team into trying a return and nailing them inside the 20. So it's 20-14 after 3 quarters. Thayer Munford got hurt, some sort of foot injury, and Prince started getting blown up. So the third quarter was very difficult for the Ohio State offense. Then in the fourth quarter, Hobble from 27 made it 23-14, and then a nice, probably one of the nicest catches you'll see. KJ Hill sticks his hand up, one-hands it, and takes it 27 yards for the final score of 30-14. Huge day for KJ. Just a great day for him, and very happy for KJ Hill. 9 catches, 187 yards, 2 touchdowns, probably we talk about him all the time, but he still seems to be one of the more underrated names on the Ohio State roster.
Yeah, KJ Hill, we talk about all the other wide receivers that, Paris Campbell's faster and Austin Mack, seems to, be Haskins' favorite. But you've heard me say it. I just think that KJ Hill is the most consistent guy. I mean, regardless of speed, regardless of hands, I just think his consistency is the best thing. And it was nice to see him have such a career day with, now granted, there's still, I don't want to say a lot of football to be played, but there's still several games that I think he can make an impact, but he certainly made probably the biggest impact of his career in yesterday's performance against Minnesota. Hey, Dwayne Haskins for the second time in so many weeks, 400 yards, over 400 yards passing.
Yep.
And
33 of 44 again.
Right. And that is, now granted, I would gladly sacrifice some yards off the passing account, for more yards on the ground. But his performance the last 2 weeks has been impressive. The fact that up until 2 weeks ago, Ohio State only had one 400 plus yard passing game in its storied history, and for the last 2 weeks has done it back. It has had 400 yard games. So who's to say? I know we're going to be talking about Purdue here in a little bit. Who's to say it's not going to be 3 weeks in a row? I would not bet against it.
Yeah, Haskins actually ran 9 times, but this is more the running you want to see from Dwayne Haskins. Something's not there. He takes what's there, and he ran. He had 9 rushes, but 3 of those were sacks for minus 19 yards. The other 6 were 6 rushes for 25 positive yards. And with a long of 11. So that's the kind of running you want to see from Dwayne Haskins. I'm on the edge. There's nothing downfield. I'm getting a little bit of pressure. Let me see what I can get out of this play. And that's what we want to see. And then I want to say it's a step in his development, Chip, because I think that that's something that we haven't really seen much of this year, and now we have seen it.
Yeah, it certainly is a step in the right direction. I think the coaches must be telling him, listen, if you don't see, because I think he one of the positives of any quarterback is when they consistently keep their eyes downfield, and that's something that a lot of television analysts earlier in the season were praising Dwayne Haskins for doing so. I'm thinking most prominently when against Penn State and against TCU, that he was always keeping his eyes downfield looking for an open receiver. But I think as the defenses have figured out that Dwayne Haskins is not truly a threat to run, I think that they're getting more and more aggressive with their respective pass rush schemes and strategies. And so I think the coaches must have told him, look for something downfield, look for your safety outlet. If Dobbins is in there, or one of the tight ends. Incidentally, before I lose my train of thought, there were three receptions by tight ends, 2 of them by Luke Farrell, which were very timely. But getting back to the point, all right, you look for your quick outlet. If that's not open, run and slide and just gain positive yardage. And I think the last 2 weeks have borne out the fact that Dwayne Haskins is getting more and more comfortable with doing that and not trying to be something that he isn't.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo Mike Meals' assertion that maybe the Ohio State baseball coach needs to work with Dwayne on the sliding a little bit.
I would agree with that. Yeah, Mike is right on that one too.
Yeah. So it wasn't all bad. Obviously, there were some issues in the game. The offensive tackles had problems, which allowed Minnesota to drop back more people into coverage, which I think it took Haskins a lot of that third quarter to adjust to, because they were getting pressure with 4, so they didn't need to bring extra bodies after him in the passing game, and they were able to drop more people back, and that really kind of stalled Ohio State's offense through much of the third quarter. But Ohio State kind of got that back in the fourth quarter a bit and was able to hit some plays and get some more confidence. And then I think one of the positives I take from this game, Chip, is the late in the game when Ohio State had the ball and didn't want to give it back and wanted to run clock. That's when they ran their best all day. That is a positive. That's a situation where the defense knows you're going to run, the offense wants to run, and the offense was able to get it done. Sure, they had to convert a couple third downs through the air, but it worked. I mean, you got Dwayne Haskins. Then the other thing that I will take as a positive out of this game is that one of the big things that Minnesota's had success with this year is Seth Green out of the Wildcat, and it wasn't really all that successful. 20 yards gained on 5 plays. So they mostly shut that down, didn't give up any big plays on that. You mentioned the tight ends. I like seeing the tight ends involved in that, especially that wheel route to Luke Farrell. I was just having a moment there because that play is so awesome. You send the receivers out on a clear out. Farrell goes out on a little wheel route, and it's a great play because it's well designed and it's very, very difficult for anybody to defend.
I agree that the running game near the end of the game, it was nice to be in the stands, just knowing full well that now Ohio State they're going to be burning the clock. That's what I've kind of grown to accustomed to seeing is late in the game, controlling the game just by running the ball. Mike Weber, I know he's not 100% either, but that's where he played his best was at the tail end of the Minnesota game, being able to help Ohio State burn some much needed time off the clock. It certainly didn't hurt that Minnesota had some timeout issues in terms of when they use their timeouts, but you have to if your opposition is willing to make those mistakes, you certainly don't want to get in their way. So PJ Fleck, for all of the praise by pulling out all the stops, I was in the stands wondering what the logic was, and sometimes with the timeouts that they called, because at the tail end of the game when Minnesota still was kind of giving Ohio State fits, they had no timeouts left, and that's what allowed Ohio State to kind of really burn the clock down at the tail end and ice the victory.
Right, and it just underscores how good it was to see Ohio State run in that situation, because Minnesota was geared up for the run. They knew the run was coming, and Ohio State still was able to rip off 4, 5, 6 yard runs where earlier in the game it was -1, 1 yard, no gain. And I think against Indiana, I think the longest run from scrimmage by a running back was 9 yards, but each Weber and Dobbins each went for double figures, a 10-yard and a 12-yard long for those two this week. So slight improvement maybe against a little bit better run defense, a little bit more stout in the run game than I think Indiana is. And, it's not all bad, as I think is what I'm trying to get across. Is it where it needs to be for a national championship? Absolutely not. Is it where it needs to be even to get through November and get to Indianapolis? No. But it's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think this is a team that is much more dangerous when they're provoked, when they're when they get their emotions into the game, and we haven't seen that since Penn State. But when they're emotionally invested in the game, they play at a much higher level across the board, offense and defense. And I think you've seen 2 weeks in a row where the emotions were not high. And that's on the coaching staff. It's on the players too, but it's on the coaching staff for not being able to – I mean, it's really difficult. I know it's probably the hardest thing to do in coaching is to get a team up for a game where they know they can win if they just show up.
Am I mistaken, or maybe it's just me, but for all of the criticism of the defense, fair or unfair, am I mistaken in believing that the Ohio State defense, even though they were close games, that they played better against TCU and at Penn State than they have against Indiana and Minnesota? Because it certainly seems like it, even though we lamented how Trace McSorley went for over 170 yards on the ground and how TCU were making big plays and all these kind. It just seems as though the Ohio State defense played better in those games than they have the last 2 weeks against Indiana and Minnesota at home. Or is that just me?
I certainly think there are more lapses in the recent games, where, just a regular average run-of-the-mill running back rips off a 30-yard run. I mean, you would expected that more against TCU than you do against Indiana and Minnesota. But I think one of the things that I like, and I know that Greg Schiano said post-game that people just executed better in the second half. They didn't really make a lot of adjustments. I still think they made some adjustments because the second half defense in the last 3 weeks has been noticeably better than the first half.
Yeah, it's just, I think the biggest thing that is so concerning is because talking about it from the perspective of the fans in the stadium is when Minnesota was completing slants,
Mm-hmm.
just and we've lamented that all season.
Right.
That the fans that I was sitting, it's like, oh, what a surprise, running a slant, and for the fans to be seeing it, how the coaching staff isn't adjusting what they're doing that's concerning because the next opponent, full well that Purdue offensively Jeff Brom as the head coach is very, very creative, that they're going to be able to take advantage of Ohio State if Ohio State's defense doesn't make adjustments to the way that they're doing that currently.
Well, you look at Rondale Moore, obviously we're going to get into our Purdue discussion, but he's a guy who's like KJ Hamler. He can catch that and go to the house rather than the guys that Indiana and Minnesota ran out there the last couple weeks. And what Pete Werner said after the game was that in these run pass options that they're seeing, if the linebackers commit to the run, they throw a slant. The question that nobody seems to be asking the coaching staff is, if that's the case and the linebackers commit to the run, the slant is the route that they hit. Why are the defensive backs not taking that away? Why are they not playing such inside leverage that there's no way you could commit to a slant at that point, because it's just you have to run through the defensive back to get there. Or the other thing too is that we've seen this in years past from other Ohio State defensive coordinators, is why not run a zone blitz where you see the linebackers come, you make that read, now you're throwing into a slant area, but you didn't. Whoops! I didn't realize Draymond Jones was dropping back into that slant area. Now he's picked off the pass.
Right, and as you said, Draymond Jones, he's not 100%, but he certainly, I think, against TCU, he showed that he has that capability of being able to pick off a pass. Now, granted, it wasn't on the slant, but I think he made a timely interception. It would certainly lead you to believe that. I appreciate what Pete Werner said about the linebackers are kind of caught in a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing when it comes to the RPOs that the opposition is throwing. I also agree with you, though, that there are things that they can do in terms of with the way that the defensive backs are lining up. The corners could force the issue and take away that inside option, as you also noted. The defensive ends dropping back into coverage, kind of negating that slant option. Justin Hilliard made a nice play being able to swat down one of those slants yesterday in the game. So there are things that can be adjusted. It just seems as though that the defensive staff is reluctant to do so or very slow to do so.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the issue is in the coaching room. I don't know if there's a difference in philosophy or if it's stubbornness, and we just have to make sure that we get these kids to do it right, do it the way we want to, and it'll be fine. But yeah, I mean, for me, I say this: just don't rush the linebackers as if give the linebackers a beat or two, and I'd much rather give up a 4-yard run than a 15-yard slant pass. That's just me.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if those guys take a step backward and they're reading and reacting and it's a run play, they're still good enough players, and the defensive line is good enough that they should be able to stop that play for, like I said, 4 or 5 yards tops. I would much rather give that up than a 15-yard play, especially on a 3rd and 6.
Yes.
I mean, I don't care if they run on a 3rd and 6. Let them run the football on a 3rd and 6. If you take away the better play for picking up the first down, to me that seems like that would be the logical thing to do. But we're not in the room. Certainly this is something they've discussed. They're not idiots. I mean, you don't get to this point in your career and get the accolades they have and win all the games that they have by being stupid. There's just something we're not seeing, and there's something that's not being asked in the press conferences to uncover why this continues to take place. It could be a matter of we can't zone blitz because the guys are not executing that properly in practice. We can't we can't just keep the linebackers back because right now, Draymond's hurt and Robert Landers has been, banged up and these guys are getting pushed around. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe the cornerbacks are not good at keeping inside leverage. I don't know. Or maybe they're doing it in practice and it's just not translating to games. There's a reason this is happening. We just don't happen to know it, and that's the frustrating part.
It's frustrating, but I can only guess that the coaches are going to be burning the midnight oil this week because they know they're going into a team that is known for its offensive, let's just say, ingenuity. Mm-hmm. And I think you talk about having the players' attention and having them up for this game, knowing that it's a night game, that Purdue has always been a thorn in Ohio State's side, especially in Ross-Ade Stadium. That if anything, I think the players, if they're not up for this one, I don't know what Ohio State coaches can possibly do because the eyes of the nation are going to be upon them, considering it's a night game.
Yeah, it's a national TV night game. I think that they'll be a little more jacked up about this. Hopefully guys that are dinged up will be, getting a little bit closer to full health. But yeah, they have to take this seriously because, I guess we're moving into the Purdue part of things now. We're off the Minnesota part of things, but Purdue, as the 10th ranked total offense in the country, they're racking up 510 yards a game, 7th in the pass, 331 yards a game. So this is an offense that can move the football, and they've got Rondale Moore is a very dynamic player who we talked about him. He's a lot like Turpin for TCU in that any play can go the distance, and he's also, I believe, he's a young kid. He's a freshman, and I don't know what size he is, but he's not a guy that got tons of looks from the major colleges, right?
Yeah, you're correct. The one thing about Purdue, and this is let's just take more out of the equation. Historically, Purdue, their recruiting classes are never usually highly touted guys. It's not, it's like, like Johnny 5-star as Bill King kind of, likes to refer to a lot of things as it relates to recruiting. But the one thing about Purdue traditionally through the years, and this even goes back beyond the glory days of Drew Brees when he was playing under Joe Tiller, is that Purdue historically has been a program that has usually been throwing the ball all over the place, usually has good quarterbacks, usually has offenses that are, I don't want to say difficult to stop, but are enjoyable to watch, put it that way. And they also being able to find guys that may not necessarily be highly touted, but they put them in a position to succeed and do well. And getting back to Rondale Moore, he is certainly fits that category of let's just say, less known in the recruiting cycles, but well utilized by the Purdue coaching staff.
Yeah, a little bit of money ball going on there for Purdue, finding a guy who doesn't necessarily have the measurables, but certainly can play the game. We talked about that a little bit with the Antoine Winfield Jr. Maybe doesn't have the wingspan you want or the height you want or whatever, the physique that you want, but good players are good players, and he's going to be a guy to watch. David Blau is a quarterback who's thrown 10 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. That doesn't sound like a lot of touchdowns when you consider Dwayne Haskins, but he's completing 68% of his passes. He's really been the reason that Purdue's taken off. They lost their first 3 games, all very close losses, but they've won their last 3. And he's one of the reasons why. If you've watched him play the last few weeks, he's been on point. He's delivering the ball well. He's making good reads. He's not putting his team in jeopardy by making bad throws.
No. And I'm not sure if it was by design or because it was so close, but there was kind of, a rotating quarterback mentality that it seems as though that they've gone away from that. Mm-hmm. And that Blau has definitely been the recipient of just going, he's been playing his best football this season, not having to look over his shoulder. So this is going to be a very difficult game for Ohio State without a doubt. I think the Ohio State defense is struggling schematically. They're struggling personnel wise with injuries. I mean, it is going to be a challenge. The fact that if there's a saving grace is that Ohio State offensively, they have a quarterback who can match what Purdue is doing throwing the ball. It just remains to be seen how the Buckeyes what they try to do to slow down this Purdue offense.
Yeah, one thing that I believe that we've seen a lot of this year is a very vanilla Ohio State defense. And I don't know if that's a product of not wanting to put things on film for the teams like Michigan, Michigan State late in the season, or if they just don't feel comfortable, dialing up any exotics. But you see them every once in a while. You saw it on the game-stopping play against Penn State, where they had a little bit different look. They looped the defensive ends inside, but you don't see a lot of like line slants and things like that. And Ohio State really needs to be sound because DJ Knox is a running back. He's a senior that can hurt them. He's averaging 6 yards a carry and 90 yards a game. He's got 5 touchdowns. He's a guy who can hurt you in the running game if you give up one of those long plays. And
considering that we talked, I know we're talking about Purdue, but just looking back at everything Minnesota did on the ground, they gave up 150 something yards on the ground. Like you said, Knox is certainly capable of doing that much and more to hurt Ohio State.
Yeah, it's very imperative that Ohio State gets healthy on defense, or at least finds another gear, because Annexstad wasn't really threatened much. And, I mean, he was only 13 of 23 through 2 interceptions. But he should have he was only sacked twice. And that's not Ohio State football. Ohio State was, I believe, one of the top sacking defenses in the country coming into this weekend.
And let's face it, he would have had a touchdown if not for Isaiah Pryor making that interception. Now, granted, I'm still kind of perplexed as to why Isaiah Pryor, that wasn't marked a touchback, but it doesn't matter. Ohio State, they were fortunate because that was going to be a touchdown. Pete Werner was completely, he was giving good chase, but was nowhere close to being able to impact what would have been a touchdown reception by Minnesota. So if Purdue can get Ohio State linebackers in coverage, the Buckeyes are in big trouble.
I'm glad you reminded me of that play. I meant to go back and watch that to see what happened to Annexstad on that play, because that ball was really high. Like, it was quacking. I don't know if it came out of his hand wrong, if his arm was hit, or if there was some pressure there for a change, but that ball came out of his hand weird, and it hung up there. And as soon as it left his hand, I thought, I hope we got a safety back there somewhere, because you can't see the whole field on the TV, and it's like, okay, cool, we had a safety back there, and he intercepted it. But yeah, it was one of those things too where I thought Ohio State would have the ball at the 20, and they ruled that he caught it in the field of play and then went into the end zone. I wasn't sure that he had full possession until he crossed the goal line, but they didn't have enough evidence to change it, so that's why Ohio State. And that was kind of a scary moment too, because I thought the way Minnesota's defense has played, I could easily see a 2-yard loss on a running play here and a safety. And
yeah,
it was, I think, one of those rare 8-yard runs from Dobbins or something on the next play, and to get him out of there. But my memory's a little fuzzy, but I do know they got off the goal line, so that's all that matters. Anything else you want to say? I know we've already started on Purdue, but is there anything else that stuck out to you from the Minnesota game that you wanted to discuss?
No, I think we've covered Minnesota exhaustively. I think a win's a win, but there are certainly a lot of warning signs that are very foreboding, not just going into the Purdue game, but in general for the rest of the season that Ohio State needs to get fixed.
Yeah. 10 different Buckeyes caught passes in this game, Chip, led by KJ Hill's 9. Paris Campbell had 8. No big breakaways for Paris this week. They did a really good job bottling him up. And then everybody else was like threes and twos the rest of the way down. But it was a huge day for KJ Hill, and I'm very happy about that. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he does the rest of the season. Purdue, Chip. Oh, actually, one more thing. Offensive and defensive players of the game. KJ Hill, I believe, was the offensive player of the game, and Jordan Fuller was the defensive player of the game.
Well deserved for KJ Hill. And defensively, I have to confess, I think you could make an argument that Jordan Fuller certainly played well, but we just mentioned Isaiah Pryor. We talked about some of the other players that it's been a struggle. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. It wasn't a big day for really many players on the defense. Fuller had 12 tackles, 9 solos. Pete Werner had 10 and had a sack and 2.5 tackles for loss. So it would have had to have been one of those two. Pryor did have 5 tackles and the interception. Really not a lot on the defense other than that. Draymond Jones did have a sack to his credit where he came in unimpeded, just exploded like you would expect Draymond to do nearly every play. And Chase Young had 1 tackle for loss where he kind of tried to one-up KJ Hill's one-handed touchdown with a one-handed tackle for loss.
Yeah, that one-handed touchdown is going to be very difficult to outdo. I have nothing wrong with people making tackles or receptions with both hands. Put it that way.
Looking forward, is Brandon Bowen ready to come back?
I would dispute that. We're not privy to the medical, but from what I saw, Brandon Bowen walking with the personnel, just he was wearing his jersey, he wasn't wearing pads or anything.
Right. They've said I think 3 weeks in a row. I think that Urban has said he's close. He's getting close.
Okay. Well,
but, if he's not in uniform, how close is he really?
Well, that kind of, I think that lends itself to something that Gerd and Tom were talking about on their across the field post game, was the idea of when Brandon Bowen is healthy enough, reinserting him back into the starting lineup in lieu of possibly, Michael Jordan moving from center to guard and Bowen back, and let's see if Brady Taylor, if he's healthy, because maybe what is contributing to the struggles with the offensive line is everyone marvels at the size of the offensive line, but maybe the mobility is being impacted by that size. When we talk about Malcolm Pridgeon, Demetrius Knox, how mobile are they when it comes to any of the things that require the offensive lineman to be much more agile laterally? Mm-hmm. Some of the quick running plays, that traps and things of that nature, that the offensive line, getting out, pulling, all those kind of things that guards that you look for in terms of their mobility, that maybe that's might be a contributing factor. Your question was about Brandon Bowen. I'm skeptical, but again, we're not privy to the medical record. We're not privy to what's going on behind the scenes. Perhaps Urban Meyer is saying that because he does know. It just seems to me that I would rather take my time with Brandon Bowen rather than rush him back and subject him to possible even further serious injury.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that this staff would do that, but something needs to happen. I think you're on to something there in terms of the size of this offensive line. It's something that gets mentioned literally every week on the broadcast of how big they are. And we saw it in TCU a little bit for the first time, where they talked about the size differential and how quick TCU's defensive linemen were, and they were able to get in between, and they were able to shoot gaps, and they were able to get in behind the pulling guards and even the pulling center, because Michael Jordan does a fair bit of pulling as well, and break up plays in the backfield. And that's something that you have seen the last couple weeks from the smaller players on Indiana and Minnesota. But if they're able to go up against similarly sized guys, or at least, bigger defensive linemen like we saw at Penn State, they actually played better against Penn State.
Yeah, like I said, I just think that something has to change. Either I'm more inclined to believe that they need to simplify the offense, what you suggested earlier, because the typical response from the coaches is that the players have to execute it better. All right, well, if the players need to execute it better, then maybe it's too complicated, which is interfering with the execution of the offense in and of itself. So that's where I'm inclined to believe by simplifying the offense, regardless of when we were talking earlier about we're going to get rid of the whole RPO for Dwayne Haskins, that would help. I think there's also something to be said about if you're going to be running the ball instead of things that require, since the offensive line may be too big and not fast enough to be able to, with regards to guards pulling, for example, maybe we're going to put in plays that's just going to require just, I don't want to say brute strength, but a lot more straight power plays that will benefit both Weber and Dobbins. I don't know. I just think something has to change because we're getting closer and closer to the November stretch run, and the offense seems to be regressing. It seems like it's been regressing ever since the big game against TCU. I mean, that they were able to just simply out talent their opposition with regards to Tulane, Indiana, and Minnesota. But we all know that going into this week against Purdue and some of the games in November, that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, and it could be a case too if the O-line has things simplified, they may actually become more confident and actually be able to put that stuff back into the offense. If it's something that where they get their swagger, that's something that maybe they can try some of that stuff and mix it in and see how it goes and maybe bring it back. But right now, this is not a very confident offensive line. You can tell. And I agree completely with your earlier assessment on Isaiah Prince. You could see him hitting himself in the helmet, putting his face in his hands after plays. He knew he was messing up. He knew he wasn't doing well. I thought they did a good job on the broadcast about pointing out exactly what he was doing wrong in terms of his technical or his technique. He was staying too rigid with his back too straight. He wasn't getting enough bend and that kind of thing, and all the terminology that they pull out. But this is something that needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed in a hurry. An Ohio State team that can't run the ball, I don't know what that. I've never known what that has looked like. I mean, since maybe the Lydell Ross years.
Well, yeah, I keep going back to Gerd and Tom. I thought they made a really good point. Speaking of Lydell Ross, yeah, that was 2004. That was, in essence, a completely different offensive philosophy for all of the bashing of trestle ball. But that was where, when you think about it, that was an offense that was designed to be, just very low risk. We're going to run the ball. We're going to play very simplistically with a passing offense. But in 2004, they kind of stumbled into, by accident, just by virtue of an injury to Justin Zwick, that opened up the playing opportunity for Troy Smith. And oh, by the way, that's when Teddy Ginn started to emerge as not just a special teams threat, but also as a wide receiver. Mm-hmm. And then Anthony Gonzalez was a redshirt freshman. And the next thing you know, oh my gosh, we actually have a mobile quarterback who has a very strong arm, and we have two very quick wide receivers, and that supplemented the lack of a running game. But that was by accident. This just seems a lot more of a regression. I don't want to say that it's a matter of Dwayne Haskins, that they're relying on him too much, but there's something to be said about teams that when they're focused exclusively on throwing the ball. It just seems like the offense is completely built around the quarterback, whereas in traditionally with Ohio State, like you said, this is new for you, it's new for me. Mm-hmm. That traditionally with Ohio State, you're used to the running game being the focus, and that's because the offensive line is usually the focal point. It's the understated but well-known fact that the game is won or lost in the trenches, and the Ohio State offensive line has usually been the Urban Meyer has never been reluctant in singing the praises of having a good offensive line. Mm-hmm. And it's quite telling that the offensive line has not been on the receiving end of any kind of praise from Urban Meyer after the Indiana game, and I highly suspect they won't be on the receiving end of praise after the Minnesota game. So hopefully they'll get back to something that works for running the ball, because they've got the talent on the line. They certainly have the talent in the backfield to make it happen.
Yeah, I noted in the first half of that game they had a replay from the end zone camera, and they showed the Ohio State line backing into pass protection, and I thought at that point, that's where I really first started to consider the size of Ohio State's offensive line and how it might be might be too big in terms of running the football because of the quickness aspect of it. Because in the pass protection aspect of it, and of course the tackles got roasted on Saturday, although they've been pretty good most of the year. I actually got in a little bit of a Twitter beef with somebody who was saying that Isaiah Prince has always been bad, but he actually had been playing at a pretty good level. And I noticed that these are guys that are hard to move, they're hard to run around. They are much more suited for pass blocking than they are for run blocking, unless, as you said, you can just brute force hammer, maybe narrow those splits down a little bit and just let Dobbins and Weber just run right behind those guys, just straight forward.
Just something. Yeah. I don't know what it is. I'm not trying to sound insensitive to the fact that the coaching staff, if we're seeing it, and again, you were watching the game on television, I was in the stands, and the fans across the country are seeing the same thing. If we're all seeing it, I can assure you, and I think you would agree with me, the coaching staff's seeing it too. Urban Meyer is...
He says it every week. He says, we see what you see.
Yeah. So I can only guess that with it, there must be either the lack of confidence in the personnel behind the starters, and what I mean by that is they have they have Michael Jordan at center, and that was kind of, when you go back to the very beginning of the season, everyone thought it was going to be Brady Taylor, possibly Josh Myers, and then the rumors and whispers, okay, it's going to be Michael Jordan. Well, that came to fruition. So just using Michael Jordan as an example, the fact that he won that job speaks to what the coaching staff felt or believed about Brady Taylor and Josh Myers being ready to do the job. Right. And you could make that same argument across every one of those offensive line positions. So my concern is if they can see, and I completely believe them when they say that we see the same thing you're seeing, that if there is some kind of issue with, we're seeing there's struggles running the ball, that the coaching staff that they have to be trying to figure out ways to maximize the talent that's there on that line. What's concerning going into Purdue is Thayer Munford suffered, I believe it was an ankle injury, but he probably will be ready to go for the Purdue game. Nonetheless, they need to do something to figure out to become better with their pass blocking, and certainly much, much, much better with their run blocking, regardless of whether it's scheme or personnel. They've got to do something.
Agreed. And I think what you said about the line, it holds true for the linebackers as well, is they are playing the players that won the position, and there's a reason why they're starting and not other guys. The backups are always very popular. Backups are always
Yes.
like amongst the fans. They're always very popular. Oh, put in this other guy. He got, he's 5 stars, but you
Right.
know, there's a reason why guys get playing time, and I know I see it every week about people. Where's Dante Booker? He played well that one game. Well, sorry, he must not be showing it on the practice field, but it is what it is. But why don't we wrap up? What else do we got to say about Purdue? I know we have to give our predictions, but Purdue, as I mentioned, seventh in the country, Chip, in pass offense, 331 yards a game, 510 total yards a game, 10th in the country. Rushing, only 59th in the country, 179. That's a little misleading because I mentioned Knox is a good player. And scoring, here's where it gets tricky. Purdue is good at moving the ball. They haven't been great at getting it in the end zone. They're 42nd in the country, but they still are averaging 33.5 points a game, which is more than Minnesota and Indiana have been averaging. And we've seen what they were able to do moving the football. Defensively, they have not been good. They're 92nd in the country in total defense. They give up 414 yards a game. That's something I think Ohio State can work with, even with a struggling offense, rush offense, that is. Their pass defense, this does not bode well for them, and it does bode well for maybe a new record to break Art Schleicher's record. 109th in the country, Chip, is Purdue. 268 yards allowed per game on average in the passing game. Rushing, they're 54th in the country, 147 yards per game. So a bit behind where some of the teams have been the last few weeks. And scoring defense, 44th in the country, allowing 23.2 points per game. What do you make of all this, and what do you think is going to happen on Saturday?
Oh, Michael, you had to give me all those stats to make that uneasiness grow. I want, just like any other Ohio State fan, I want Ohio State to win this game, but it does not feel right. It doesn't. It just seems as though that the defense has not been holding up schematically. They're battling injuries. They're going into a venue that historically has been a lot of challenges and frustration for them in years past. It's a night game. You know that the people that are going to be at that game are going to be, let's just say, well hydrated, and I think this is it's gonna have a Big 12 shootout kind of feel to it. I really do. I think this is going to be the kind of game where defense is going to be, it's going to be very, very well bent, if not broken, on both sides, because based on all those stats that you just rattled off, and Ohio State fans have grown accustomed to the talent on the Buckeye side of the ball, I think this is going to be a 49 to, I'm going to say 49-42, but unfortunately Ohio State's going to come on the losing end of this one. I'm going to say Purdue gives Ohio State their first loss of the season. Before you give your prediction, one thing before I start getting all the vitriolic tweets and anger directed towards me, and this is something to just kind of keep this in mind. I'm usually the type of person that I try to go with my head over my heart anytime that we have these predictions. The last time that I predicted Ohio State to lose was when they went to East Lansing in 2014, because it seemed as though that Ohio State, that did not seem like a venue that was designed for Ohio State to win. And as you recall, Ohio State went on the road up to East Lansing and pulled out a crucial victory against Michigan State that was essential to the 2014 national championship. So I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's going to be Purdue 49, Ohio State 42.
All right, that is quite a prediction, and not a very good one for Ohio State's defense. Chip, I don't really fault your logic. We said before we started recording, I said that if you play with fire, you get burned, and Ohio State's been playing with fire for weeks now. So I'm not, I'm with you. I think this is a game I've been nervous about because of Purdue's offense. The things that they do are not things that Ohio State's good at stopping or have been good at stopping this year, and I think that it's going to be a problematic evening on the road. Not the toughest environment, but certainly not a home game. And Purdue's going to be jacked up. They're going to, getting a national home game for them is not something that happens all the time. They're going to be pumped up. They're going to be ready to go. I think that they're going to throw some trick plays. Ohio State got roasted by a trick play by Minnesota, and they didn't score on it, but they got burned pretty badly on it. I think we're going to see several of those. And I think you're right. I think this week might be the week they get burned. And if they don't, then awesome. But I'm going to say 45-42 Purdue with a last-second field goal to win the game. So
okay.
You and I both picked Ohio State to lose this game, and I really hope we're wrong.
I do too. Like I said, I have in the past. It's not often, but I have predicted against Ohio State, and most of the time when I've done that, I've been mistaken, and I'm more than happy to swallow my pride. And I mean, I choke a little, but I can do it. And I certainly hope that I'm mistaken. I'm certainly hoping that Greg Schiano and the rest of the defensive coaching staff, they figure out whatever has been ailing the Ohio State defense in more than enough time before toe meets leather on Saturday night in West Lafayette.
Mm-hmm. I would be happy to eat crow next week on this very
Absolutely.
program. All right, Chip. So we've given our predictions. We've talked about Purdue. We talked about Minnesota. I think we're good for this week. I want to remind everybody to listen to all of our programs on the Ozone Radio Network, the Sons of Schmidt, the Buckeye Sloopcast, of course, Across the Field with Tony Gerdeman and Tom Orr. You can read all of our stuff at theozone.net. That's the-ozone.net in the Hayes and Cannon section. And where else can people find you, Chip?
On Twitter at Chip Minnich, Minnich. And like the grumpy old Buckeye here, I'm a contributor to theozone.net, as well as I'm a contributor to Athlon Sports.
All right. And you can find me at Mike36fan on Twitter. Please ask us some questions. If you have some questions, send them to us on Twitter. We'll be happy to answer them on the podcast. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or your favorite outlet, and leave us some reviews. Leave us, if you think we're worth 5 stars, give us 5 stars. If you think we're worth 1 star, give us 5 stars.
Certainly.
All right, Chip, we'll come back next week. We'll do it all again. We will talk about Ohio State at Purdue, and of course, we will dissect that game as we always do. We will hopefully be eating crow, like I mentioned.
Yes.
And and we'll see if some of this stuff got fixed. And if some of these injured or banged up guys got healthy enough to make a difference. I'd really certainly like to see a big game from Chase Young, because it's been since the Penn State game since we've really had an unbelievable outing from him. I don't like his propensity to disappear, but he has kind of disappeared in recent weeks. So we'll talk about that. We'll see how everybody shaked out for this contest, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about whether or not Urban Meyer, had he known that Dwayne Haskins was going to be so good that he might be one and done, might have not leaned toward Joe Burrow. That is a very big topic of conversation among the fans right now.
Well, certainly Joe Burrow is aiding in that conversation with the performance he's giving for the LSU Tigers. It's certainly giving food for thought.
Yeah. So let's get through this week. Then we got a bye week, and everybody can get healthy for Nebraska. The home game on the 3rd of November. So that'll do it for this edition of the Silver Bullets podcast. Thanks for listening, as always. And I'm Michael Citro on behalf of Chip Minnich saying, Go Bucks!
Go Bucks!